Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Locked Room. Laura had been searching for weeks. Between her hectic work schedule and Ethan's constant travel, they hadn't had a proper weekend together in months. So, when she stumbled across the listing for a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods, cozy, charming, and utterly private, it felt like fate. The photos showed a rustic interior with a stone fireplace, a sunlit kitchen, and a deck overlooking the dense forest. The reviews raved about its tranquility. It seemed perfect. When they arrived late Friday afternoon, the golden hues of sunset bathed the cabin in warmth. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. Laura breathed in deeply, letting the stress of city life fall away. Ethan, carrying their bags, grinned. "This place is incredible," he said, stepping onto the creaky wooden porch. "Good find, babe." Inside, the cabin was exactly as advertised. A fire was already laid in the hearth, ready to be lit. The furniture was simple but inviting, and sunlight poured in through the large windows. They explored each room, marveling at the quaint touches: worn books on the shelves, an old rocking chair by the window, and a collection of ceramic owls lined up on the mantel. But at the end of the narrow hallway was a door that didn't match the others. While the rest of the cabin had aged pine doors, this one was newer, painted stark white, and equipped with a shiny brass handle. A thick padlock hung from a latch above the knob. "What do you think's in there?" Ethan asked, rattling the lock. It clinked dully against the metal. Laura pulled out her phone and opened the message from the host. "It says here it's a storage room. Off limits." Ethan shrugged. "Weird. They could have just said that in the listing." Laura felt a twinge of unease, but brushed it off. She didn't want to start their weekend with paranoia. "Come on," she said, grabbing his hand. "Let's start that fire and open some wine." That night, after dinner and a few glasses of Merlot, they curled up on the couch by the crackling fire. The cabin's charm worked its magic, and they laughed and talked late into the night. When the fire finally died down to embers, they stumbled to bed, blissfully content. But sometime in the night, Laura woke up. She wasn't sure why at first. The room was pitch black, the only sound the soft hum of the wind outside. Then she heard it, a faint creaking noise, like footsteps on old wood. She turned toward Ethan, who was still sound asleep. She strained her ears. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Her heart thudded, but she told herself it was nothing. Old cabins made noises. Wood settled. Pulling the blanket tighter around herself, she forced her eyes shut. The next morning, over breakfast, Laura mentioned the noises. Ethan frowned, stirring his coffee. "I thought I heard something too," he admitted. "It was weird though. I could have sworn I heard whispering." Laura laughed nervously. "Probably just the wind." "Yeah," Ethan said, but his tone was unconvincing. They spent the day hiking the nearby trails, marveling at the towering trees and the crisp autumn air. By the time they returned to the cabin, their earlier unease had faded. They were exhausted, their legs sore, and the thought of a quiet evening sounded perfect. But as Laura set the table for dinner, something caught her eye. A mug sat on the counter, half filled with water. She froze. Neither of them had used that mug. "Did you leave this out?" she asked Ethan. He looked up from his phone, confused. "No. Why?" "It's just weird. I didn't either." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe the host left it, or maybe you forgot." But Laura was certain she hadn't. The unease crept back, nagging at her like a splinter. That night, Laura's sleep was restless. She kept waking up, convinced she'd heard something. Around 2 a.m., she thought she saw a shadow move across the room, but when she turned on the bedside lamp, there was nothing there. Ethan groaned, half asleep. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I just feel like someone's here." "No one's here," Ethan muttered, turning over. Go back to sleep? But she couldn't, and the next morning her fears escalated. When she returned from a solo walk, she found her bag on the bed, unzipped, its contents scattered. "Ethan, did you go through my bag?" she demanded. He shook his head. "Of course not." Her skin prickled. "Someone's been in here." Ethan frowned but tried to reassure her. "Maybe it fell over. You're overthinking it." But Laura wasn't convinced. That night, Ethan set his phone on the dresser to record the hallway. "Just to prove there's nothing there," he said. But Laura noticed the tension in his voice. At 3:07 a.m., they both woke to a soft thud, then another. Ethan grabbed his phone, fumbling to stop the recording. "Let's see what it caught," he said, his voice trembling. The footage was grainy but clear. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., the locked door at the end of the hallway shifted. Slowly, it creaked open an inch. A dark shape emerged, just barely visible in the dim light. It looked human, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, its arms too long. The figure peered out, its face obscured by shadow, then retreated, pulling the door shut behind it. Laura gasped, covering her mouth. Ethan stared, his face pale. "We're leaving. Now." They packed in silence, too terrified to speak. By the time the sun rose, they were miles away, their hearts still racing. Later, Laura checked the listing out of morbid curiosity. It was gone, completely removed from the platform. But a forum thread mentioned similar stories. Strange noises, moving shadows, and that locked door. No one ever got an answer from the host, and no one ever found out what or who was behind it. Sometimes Laura dreams of that cabin. In her dreams, the locked door opens wider, and the shadow steps closer. She always wakes before it reaches her, heart pounding, the creaking sound echoing in her ears. Story 2. The Watcher's Window. Emily arrived in the city on a gray, rainy afternoon, her suitcase rattling along the cracked sidewalk as she searched for her Airbnb. She'd booked a small studio apartment in a towering building downtown, promising convenience and modern comfort. As she entered the lobby, she couldn't help but feel a slight chill, though she chalked it up to the gusts of wind that had followed her in from the street. The check-in process was simple. The host had left the key in a lockbox outside, and Emily let herself into the unit on the 5th floor. It was cozy, with sleek furniture and large windows offering a view of the surrounding skyscrapers. The city seemed alive from this vantage point, a bustling, vibrant place. But as she surveyed the room, she noticed one thing that irked her. The blinds on the largest window didn't fully close, leaving a thin gap that exposed part of the room to prying eyes. She tugged at the blinds, trying to force them shut, but they wouldn't budge. Annoyed but tired, she decided to let it go. After all, what were the chances anyone could see her? The neighboring buildings seemed mostly offices, and the windows across the way were dark and lifeless. Shrugging off her unease, Emily unpacked her things and settled in for the night. Around 10 p.m., as she lay scrolling through her phone in bed, she noticed a strange glint from the building across the street. At first, she thought it was a reflection from a passing car, but the light remained steady. Squinting, she realized it wasn't just a light. It was the unmistakable flash of binocular lenses. Someone was watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure silhouetted in the window. They stood motionless, their face obscured by shadows, but the intent was clear. Emily's pulse quickened as 1,000 questions raced through her mind. Who were they? How long had they been standing there? And why were they watching her? Fighting the rising panic, she rolled off the bed and crept to the light switch, plunging the apartment into darkness. She moved to the side of the window and peeked through the narrow gap in the blinds. The figure was still there, staring directly at her. The binoculars lowered slightly, revealing a pale, expressionless face. Emily stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? Someone's watching me from another building didn't exactly scream emergency. She grabbed her phone and texted the Airbnb host instead. Emily, hi, I think someone is watching me from the building across the street. The blinds don't fully close, and I'm feeling unsafe. Is there anything you can do? The reply came quickly. Host, sorry to hear that. It's probably just someone working late. The city never sleeps, you know. Try not to worry. Not exactly reassuring. Emily decided to ignore the host's dismissive tone and focus on blocking out the view. She draped a blanket over the gap in the blinds and tried to convince herself she was overreacting. People worked odd hours in the city. Maybe the person had just been bored and curious. That explanation unraveled at midnight when she heard the first tap. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the city outside. Tap, tap, tap. She froze, straining her ears. The sound came again, sharper this time, as if someone were tapping on the glass of her window. Her blood ran cold. She was on the 5th floor. That was impossible. Gathering her courage, Emily crept toward the window. The blanket she draped earlier had slipped slightly, leaving part of the glass exposed. She leaned in, her breath fogging the pain, and peeked out. There was nothing there, only the reflection of her own wide-eyed face staring back at her. Relief flooded her for a moment. Then she saw it, a handprint, smudged, large, and unmistakably human, on the outside of the glass. Emily stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. The apartment door felt miles away as she grabbed her phone and dialed the host again. The line rang twice before they answered. Hey, it's me again, Emily stammered. There's a handprint on my window. From the outside. I think someone's trying to get in. The host sighed audibly. It's just the wind. They said they're tone flat. The windows can collect dirt and smudges over time. It's nothing to worry about. But it's fresh. Emily protested, and I heard tapping. The line went dead. Emily barely slept that night. She kept every light in the apartment on, clutching a kitchen knife as she sat on the couch, her eyes darting between the window and the door. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When daylight finally broke, she packed her bags in record time. She didn't even bother cleaning up. She just wanted to get out. As she left the building, she glanced one last time at the neighboring apartment. It was completely empty, its windows dusty and abandoned. There was no way anyone had been inside. Later that day, Emily stumbled across a local forum while searching for reviews of the Airbnb. Her blood turned to ice as she read a thread titled, "Strange Experiences at Building." One user detailed an eerily similar encounter. A figure watching from across the street, tapping on the window, and a host who dismissed their fears. Emily reported her experience to Airbnb and the police, but the host's listing vanished shortly after, leaving her with more questions than answers. She never learned who or what had been watching her that night, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never book an Airbnb alone again. Story 3. The Host Who Never Left. Mike turned the wheel of his battered SUV onto a narrow gravel road lined with trees that clawed at the gray sky. The farmhouse loomed at the end of the drive, its paint peeling and shutters hanging slightly askew. But it exuded a rustic charm that had drawn them to the Airbnb listing in the first place. Mike glanced in the rearview mirror at his friends. Jared, a practical joker. Lucy, his sister who thrived on ghost stories. And Ben, the quiet one who always seemed to sense things before anyone else did. Well, this looks like the set of every horror movie ever, Lucy quipped, adjusting her scarf as the wind tugged at her hair when they stepped out. Jared laughed, but Ben just stared at the house, his eyes narrowed. Their host, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Whitmore, emerged from the front door, her smile wide but not quite reaching her eyes. Her gray hair was tied in a severe bun, and her apron was spotless, almost too spotless, as though she'd changed it just for their arrival. "Welcome, welcome. I'm Mrs. Whitmore," she said, extending a hand to Mike. Her grip was firmer than expected, her eyes scanning over the group like she was cataloging them. "It's always nice to see young folks enjoying the countryside. Now, let me show you around." She walked them through the house, pointing out the cozy living room with its ancient fireplace, the quaint kitchen with mismatched cabinets, and the creaky staircase that led to the bedrooms. There were 4 rooms, each sparsely furnished but clean. Mrs. Whitmore's tone was cheerful, but her questions came rapid fire. "Who's staying in which room?" she asked, her gaze flicking between them. "What are your plans for the weekend? Any late nights?" "Just relaxing," Mike replied, uneasy with her persistence, but brushing it off. She'd probably just like to know who was in her house. By the time she left, night had fallen, and the wind howled around the house like a hungry animal. They spent the evening playing board games and sharing beers, laughter filling the rooms. Jared, ever the prankster, tried to spook Lucy by pretending to see a shadow outside the window, but no one took him seriously. The first night passed uneventfully, though the old house groaned and settled, as old houses do. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. Lucy was the first to notice. "Hey, who's been eating my granola bars?" she asked, holding up an empty wrapper. "I left these in my bag." "Not me," Jared said, shrugging. "Ben." Ben shook his head, his face pale. "I didn't touch them." Mike dismissed it as a mix-up, but the feeling of unease settled in his stomach like a stone. Later, when they went to bed, he noticed the light in the guest bathroom was on. He flicked it off, certain he'd turned it off earlier, and climbed into bed. At 2 a.m., he woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, as though someone was pacing. His first thought was Jared pulling a prank, but when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. The air was cold, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and makes your breath visible. "Jared, quit it," Mike muttered, but there was no answer. The next morning, they discovered the back door was unlocked. Mike was certain he'd bolted it before bed. Jared swore he hadn't touched it, and Lucy looked genuinely frightened for the first time. Maybe it was just the wind, Mike suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. Ben said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Things came to a head when Ben decided to check the attic. They hadn't ventured up there, but something about the house seemed to pull at him, like an itch he couldn't scratch. The attic was accessed by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. When Ben climbed up, the others waited below, their nerves on edge. "Guys," Ben called down, his voice tight. "You need to see this." They climbed up one by one, and what they saw made Lucy gasp. There, in the dusty attic, was a small makeshift bed, a thin mattress, a pillow, and a blanket that looked recently used. Nearby was a half-eaten sandwich, a bottle of water, and a small stack of magazines. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something sour. "Someone's been staying here," Ben said, his voice shaking. "But who?" Lucy whispered. Mike called Mrs. Whitmore, his hands trembling as he dialed. When she answered, her response was chillingly casual. "Oh, I use the attic sometimes when guests are here. It's my house, after all." "You what?" Mike stammered, his mind racing. "It's nothing to worry about," she said, her tone almost amused. "I just like to keep an eye on things. Enjoy your stay." They didn't stay another night. They packed their things and left immediately, the eerie feeling of being watched following them out the door. As they drove away, Lucy checked the reviews again. Buried among the glowing comments were a handful of one-star reviews describing strange experiences, missing items, noises in the night, and sightings of a figure in the attic. None had been taken seriously. Mrs. Whitmore's listing was gone within a week, replaced by a new one under a different name. But the memory of that weekend lingered, a haunting reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that leave unanswered questions.